Well, welcome everybody to September Collin County Hobby Beekeepers Association monthly meeting. Again, we're doing this viral, but or video. Let's just say that. What I'd like to get everybody looking for, I don't know how many people we have on here tonight, is to start thinking about club leadership that will be changing over. So get your head wrapped around volunteering and stepping up to take some positions. So looking forward to relinquishing and hopefully we can get this meeting back to in person and face to face by the first of the year. And but as far as the meeting goes, we've got a good speaker here tonight. I'll let John and Skip introduce later.
I'm ready when you are, Russell.
Well, you just go ahead and take it away, Blake.
Perfect. Okay, so while this is pulling up, this is, it's a month that we don't always think about as being a, really important month for beekeeping, right? I mean, the year is kind of winding down, and we're seeing the end of the bee season, as it were, and as it is. And so, however, I think this is one of the more important months of the whole year, because this is one of our final opportunities to affect any changes on our hives before we get into winter. So it's kind of one of the last opportunities to do something with our bees. And so because of that, it's a very, very important month. So we're going to talk about making sure our bees are as prepared as they can be going into winter, and what steps we should take to make sure we're going to come out of winter with hopefully a really strong and vibrant hive. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box or the chat box, and I can probably actually see those as you put them in, and I can answer those, or you can save it till the end, whichever you prefer, and ask them at the end. Okay, so fall blooms, we're seeing a lot of fall, really late summer and early fall flowers start to bloom. On that upper right there, you can see the snow on the mountain or snow on the prairie. It's actually winding down. So it was in full bloom last week and the week before. The snow on the mountain, snow on the prairie is starting to dry up. So there's still a lot of it out there. In most areas, I'd say it's got another good week or so left, but it's starting to fade a bit. A couple of things that are really starting to come on. That picture in the upper left-hand corner, that's what I call it broomweed. It grows out in a lot of cow pastures, a lot of fields. It's kind of, you can see it's a really tiny little yellow flower, kind of looks like a broom. And that is just starting to bloom. Now, it's really early. Usually you just see a few yellow blooms on these plants, and then it really kicks into full gear in October. This is a phenomenal source of pollen for bees late in the year. So that's just starting to bloom a little bit, and we'll see that ramp up all the way through mid-October or so. The lower left picture, you see the white aster is what I call it. That hasn't started blooming yet. We don't usually see that bloom until October. And then we've got a little bit of thistle, a little bit of sunflower still blooming. So current conditions, like I mentioned earlier, this is kind of the beginning of the end of the bee season, September. Now, something that's just fantastic. I mean, we have gotten wonderful rain. I mean, kind of abnormally good rains for late summer. And we've gotten some really cool weather. And so as a result, that trickle pollen flow has really turned into a full-on pollen flow that'll probably peak in early October, and then it'll fully conclude in late October. So this is really cool, because a lot of years we have virtually no pollen flow through the month of September. If it's a normal, hot, dry, brutal summer like we're used to, we sometimes won't have a good, strong pollen flow until October. And it might only be, 3 weeks long before we get some really cold snaps to start killing flowers. So because we've had all these really awesome rains in late August through early September, we kind of saw a pretty rough pollen dearth in most regions in July and kind of carried through August. But really the last week of August, it started improving. And the last 2 weeks, boy, the bees are just bringing in pollen like crazy. And we're also seeing a bit of an increase in nectar flow. Now, not much nectar coming in, but there's a bit of a trickle of nectar coming in. So really exciting. These are some pictures that I took Friday when I was going through bees here in North Texas. And, you can just see, these are 3 different frames. But you can see that picture on the far left, just a solid frame of pollen. The picture in the middle here, you've got brood in the middle, and you've got this beautiful band of pollen all around the brood. And then you've got the honey on the other side of that. The picture on the far right, you can see you've got a little bit of cap brood in the middle. And you've got just a tremendous amount of multicolored pollen around the edge. And 3 weeks ago, I wasn't seeing this at all. I've been feeding pollen patties since early July. So this is new in the past couple of weeks. Now, if you're in a really urban area, you might have seen some good pollen through the summer because you got a lot of folks planting flowers. But if you're in a little more rural area or even some urban areas, you probably hadn't seen this until the last couple of weeks. So this is a great sign. As a result of this, the queens are going crazy again. It was all I could do to get bees to maintain a few frames of brood through July and August. Now the queens are going crazy like it's spring again. So this is kind of the next month really, until mid-October is kind of the final push for those bees to raise all their winter population. Now, a few little concerns here. If you look at this frame, these are from 3 different bee yards, these frames, all about within 5 miles of each other. The picture on the far left, that pollen is essentially all the exact same color. It's all from the same floral source. The middle picture is about the same. This picture on the far right, though, they've actually got a pretty good multicolored pollen. And I've said this before, but I get a little bit concerned when I only see one color of pollen coming in, because the nutritional content isn't always great from one pollen source. And it's really healthy for the bees to have an array of sources of pollen to make sure they're getting the balanced nutrients that they need. So, when I'm seeing just tons of multicolored pollen coming in, I'm still giving them pollen substitute, but I'm reducing it down a bit. And we'll talk about that in a minute. These yards that I'm just still seeing only one color of pollen coming in, I'm still giving them a lot of pollen substitute just to make sure they've got that balance of nutrition to raise all those baby bees that are coming into, that are being raised right now. So let's talk a little bit about winter. What do your bees need to survive the winter? So thankfully, this picture on the right, this was when I got to go, John Talbert, you probably remember better than I do because you let me borrow your jacket there because I was probably 18 and I didn't own a real jacket at the time. But this was in Canada. I got invited to go speak at a beekeeper meeting in Canada, and it was in their winter. And up there, they've got we're actually standing by a pallet of bees, and they have to wrap them in these wraps to keep them warm because generally the snow is up over the tops of those hives. It's usually so deep that they actually have to go dig down to get air to the bees in the wintertime. So this was an unusually hot winter for them. Thankfully, we don't have to worry about that in Texas because we have really warm winters. But we do have to pay attention to what our bees need to survive even our Texas winters. So here's kind of the basics of what they need. And we need to be thinking about this right now. This next month is kind of our final month to prepare our bees for winter. So they need 30 to 40 pounds of honey or syrup in their second brood box. So their first brood box should have several frames of brood right now. It should have 2 to 4 frames of deep frames of honey. And then your second brood box, whether it's a deep or a medium, should have 30 to 40 pounds of syrup or honey stored in it. Now, a lot of folks ask, well, how do we know how much is 30 to 40 pounds? Well, a medium super, completely full, totally packed full, all the frames, is 40 pounds, 35 to 40 pounds. A deep box, completely packed full, is 60 pounds. So 55 to 60 pounds. So that kind of tells you, you know, you need a medium box that's pretty much completely full, or a deep box that's about 2/3 full. And you need to make sure they achieve that within the next month. You need to make sure your mites are under 2 per 100 bees. You need to make sure you have sufficient bee population to survive the winter, and then of course a healthy laying queen. Okay, so I'm going to try to show a video to you guys. I think my internet connection will pull this off, but this is when to stop feeding, because I've had a ton of people ask. A lot of folks I talk to are doing a really, really good job of feeding a lot. Some people are doing too good of a job. And a common question I've got is, okay, now I've got a deep and a medium and another medium, and they're all completely full of honey and syrup. What do I do? They're in a situation where their bees are actually honey bound, where you've got no room for the queen to lay because there's so much honey. So this video briefly explains what to do when your bees have too much honey, or really when to stop feeding. And then I'll get into a little bit after we watch it of how to fix the problem. So hopefully it streams okay. If it doesn't, this is on YouTube, so you can also view it on YouTube. Let me try to get it going here. There we go.
Hey everyone, let's talk about overfeeding hives. So we spend a lot of time talking about feeding, right? In the springtime, feeding to get your hive to the strength it should be. In the summertime, feeding our hives to make sure they don't starve to death. We talk a lot about feeding syrups especially. Now, pollen substitute, you can't really overfeed. But syrup, there are times where you should slow down on the feeding. So let's take a look at this hive. This is a hive that doesn't need to be fed anymore. And an alternative is you can always add additional boxes. So you either need to stop feeding in some cases, or if those top boxes are completely full of honey or syrup, you got to add another box. So let's see what's going on in this hive and talk a little bit about when to slow down or stop feeding. There's a small hive beetle, by the way, if you haven't seen them. The most satisfying crunch in all of beekeeping is that little crunch right there. Love that. So, okay, so right off the bat, we can see this is a really, what I would call a really good, strong hive. You know, when I can see the top is completely covered with bees, that's a great sign. This is a box I would say is 100% full of bees. You can see there's bees between the frames, wall to wall. So I'm gonna give them a little bit of smoke. Those bees start running down. And I can see again right away, they've got honey or syrup stored all the way to the outside frames. Totally full, completely packed. Look at that. Now, if you've been feeding heavily, this could be syrup. In this case, it's honey, but if you've been feeding heavily, it could be syrup. So this top box is completely full, wall to wall. So definitely would need to slow down the feeding in a one that's this full, or you could add another box if you want them to, say, draw out foundation for next year, or if you're right before the honey flow starts, say in early May, then you could put on your queen excluder and you could add your honey super. But in this case, we're in the summer, and so if it were me, I would probably add another box and keep feeding maybe 1/4 gallon or so per week and get them to draw out a second box. If you don't want to keep feeding, you could just stop feeding a hive like this because it's completely full. I want to go into the bottom box and take a look at one more thing, because there's one other thing that I get a little bit concerned about that we want to watch for. So we're going to pull this second box off, set it aside, and take a look down here. Because one thing I really do not want to happen is I don't want my hive to get what I call honey bound or syrup bound. If you're feeding too much they can actually fill the brood nest with honey instead of with brood. They'll kind of start reducing down the amount of space that the queen can lay. You see, we're kind of making a mess of honey. There's so much honey in here. And so yeah, so this is a little bit concerning. It's not too bad, but you can kind of see they've shrunk down the brood nest area a bit with honey. And every open cell around this brood is full of honey or syrup rather than brood. So we'll set this frame aside a little bit. Let's take a look at another frame. See, there's just honey rolling all over these bees from breaking these frames apart. So again, you kind of see there's a whole lot of capped honey around this brood. They're not filling in too bad on this frame. I'm trying to find a frame to show you an example of what I'm talking about. But you'll see in extreme cases where everywhere there's an open cell, anywhere in the hive, they filled it with nectar or honey or syrup instead of brood. You can kind of see that here where they're just filling every available cell. But in general, they've still got a lot of great brood in here. So this hive isn't really too bad. It's not a case where they are completely honey bound. I would say that they are on the verge, but they certainly are not honey bound. So again, this is a great sign. So you've got in the middle of the brood nest, you've got open cells that the queen is laying eggs and larvae in. So they are allowing her enough space to continue that laying. Kind of in here, you can see they're starting to do that a little bit. In all these open cells where you should have brood, they've put, you can see that uncapped nectar or honey or syrup in these cells. It's not too bad, but sometimes you would see this whole frame that way where every open cell is nectar instead of honey. And you don't want to see that in the middle of the brood nest. On those outside frames, it's okay, but it's not something I want to see in general. So again, with this hive, it's not too bad, but I definitely want to stop feeding them, or I want to add another box so they've got more room, because I don't want them storing all that syrup down here in this brood nest. Otherwise, they'll restrict the area where the queen can lay, and we don't want that to happen. So for other videos, you can always check out texasbeesupply.com. And for now, we're going to go check a different hive. Thanks.
Okay. So a couple of side notes on that video. As I was talking about adding another box, the time is really drawing near to when we wouldn't want to add another box. If you've got a hive that's just really packed full of honey and has a tremendous bee population, you could probably add another box. Now, you could add a box of comb for sure, but you could, if you add a box of foundation and continue kind of trickle feeding, they might draw it out. But in general, it's time to really start thinking about leaving, not adding boxes. It's just getting pretty late in the year. So this next picture, I think, does a bit of a better job illustrating what you probably had a hard time seeing in that video, which is the picture on the right. You know, you've got all that brood in the middle, and then you've got a band of honey around the edge. The picture on the left, you've got some spotty capped brood, but you can see where there was brood, instead of the queen going back and filling out the eggs and larvae again, they've just filled it with syrup or honey. And that's kind of more, seeing that in the brood nest area is one of the more classic signs that a hive is becoming honey bound. So in that case, you could stop feeding if you've got all you need up in the second box. In a severe case, if they've reduced it down and the queen's only laying on 1 or 2 frames, you can pull a couple frames full of honey out of the brood nest, and you can give them to a weaker hive and pull some empty frames out of a weaker hive and put them in the brood nest. Or if you don't have another weak hive, you can pull a few frames of honey out of the brood nest, set them 30, 40 feet away from your hives, let the bees rob all the honey out, and then put them back in that lower brood nest to give the queen some room to lay again. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to grab a few of these questions real quick because some of them really pertain to this. Someone asked, you've been feeding 1-to-1 sugar syrup to encourage comb building. When do you switch to 2-to-1 syrup for storing? Great question. Right about now. So it's about time to start switching to 2-to-1. 2-to-1 syrup, they tend to store it faster. 1-to-1, they tend to use it to build comb, and they can store it, but 2-to-1, they store a whole lot faster. So it's time to start shifting the focus away from comb building, adding boxes, making splits, et cetera, into, okay, let's get that 30 to 40 pound surplus in the second box on top of every hive because winter's coming. Someone else said that if you have one hive that's full of honey, but one next to it isn't, can you stop feeding the full hive but continue feeding the other? Or do you need to feed both to reduce robbing? So you can certainly feed one hive and not the other. Just keep an eye on them. I mean, this time of year when hives are a little more prone to robbing, I do tend to like to use internal feeders. So a top feeder or division board feeder rather than the entrance feeder. And then someone asked, what kind of gloves am I wearing in the video? Is there an advantage to storing the top box on its side while you examine the bottom box instead of laying it flat across the cover? Great question. So a lot of people ask about those gloves that I'm wearing. They're just plastic they're just the nitrile surgeon gloves. They're pretty thick there. I think those are about a 7 or 8 mil. The bees do sting through them. So to me, it's not as bad. It's more like a prick instead of a sting. Other people have worn them and said, oh no, that hurts a lot. That's a sting. So I guess it depends on what you're used to, but I like using those. If I'm just going to go out and do something really quick in the bee yard, I'll just throw on a pair of those nitrile gloves. If I'm going to split or if I'm going to be in the bees a long time, I definitely put on leather gloves. As far as the way I stood the box up on end in the bee yard, so I really like to stand the box up on end, that second box, like you saw me do, rather than laying it flat. When I lay it flat, I'm concerned about 2 things. One, crushing a bunch of bees. And then secondarily, if the queen was in that second box, I don't want her running onto the ground. By standing it up on end, I usually find that I don't crush as many bees and the queen tends to stay in the box. You wouldn't want to leave it up on end like that for a long time because you don't want to start a robbing frenzy. But, you know, for 15, 20 minutes, no, it's no problem. I love standing it up on end. Someone asked, how can you encourage them to store honey in the medium instead of where the queen needs to lay in the bottom deep? So generally speaking, as long as you don't have a queen excluder on and as long as it's not foundation, the bees try to keep the brood nest open for the queen and they're going to store the excess honey in the upper boxes. So they usually do that on their own. Now, if you've got a queen excluder on or a box of foundation, they might be a little more prone to store in that bottom box. In that case, I would pull the queen excluder off, and that'll help them move up a little bit faster. But in general, they try to, you know, move up instead of move down. You said you had no queen excluder. So I would, you know, if it's foundation, they're going to be slow to move up. If it's not foundation, in general, they're pretty good about moving that honey up and keeping the bottom open. So last question real quick before we jump back in. Someone said you did a late summer split and you've got lots of brood, but they didn't accept the queens. Is there any chance of getting queens this late? Yeah, there's a couple companies that are still selling queens, not many. If you can, there's a H&R Apiaries and Roberts Bee Company. They're still selling some queens last I checked. It is certainly getting late though. So, okay. Let's go on to the next slide. Oh, summer versus fall pollen. So this is just kind of a comparison. The picture on the far left was a picture I took about 3-4 weeks ago. Almost no pollen in the hive, just some scattered pollen. And then the picture on the right was more recent or more representative of what you're going to see in the fall. You start seeing those beautiful frames of pollen again. So great sign. Fall pollen substitute feeding. If you're only seeing a single source pollen, so almost all the pollen in your hive is just one color, I do still feed pollen substitute. Remember, if you are feeding pollen substitute, because of small hive beetles, you know, just give them about as much as they can eat in a week, which for a good strong hive is about 1 pound. Let them eat it all, get rid of all of it before putting a new pollen patty on. And that'll just keep those small hive beetle larvae at bay. On my bees, I did stop in those yards where I see full frames of pollen. I did slow down the pollen substitute feeding. I'm going to give them a break for about 2 weeks. And then October, I'm going to give them 2 patties in October per hive and then 2 patties November per hive. So I'm giving them a couple week break because we do have a lot of pollen coming in. In those yards, I'm seeing multicolored pollen. Just a real quick side note here, and I will jump back to those questions in a minute. Varroa mites are still an issue. This is the final window to really effectively treat for Varroa. So if you haven't treated, absolutely get a treatment on there after you test and make sure you've got a problem. If you have treated, but it was in early July when we were supposed to treat, then I would do another test because your levels could have certainly built back up in the past couple months to where you've got a problem again. You've got a lot more options for treatment now that it's sort of cooling off. You've got HopGuard, you've got Apigard, Apivar, oxalic acid. These things all start to work a little better in the fall. Apivar and HopGuard are the only ones that decently work in the summer. Now that it's cooling off, you can use Apigard, the thiamol-based treatment. And the less brood you have in a hive, the better the oxalic acid is going to work. So you got more options for treatments now. The key for Varroa mites, though, is test. I mean, make sure you're monitoring your hives. It's easy to test. And if you've got an issue, you've got to take care of it. If you don't have to treat. So the key is to test test. This time of year, I'm testing once a month just to keep those levels monitored. And a lot of hives need kind of a final mop-up treatment in September, and then they're good to go for the rest of the winter. Remove those queen excluders. So if you have queen excluders on your hive, get those off. Starting to get some cool nights now. You don't want the queen to be trapped below it as the bees move up to the honey. So pull those queen excluders off. Oh, and I would mention too, somebody asked the question, for entrance reducers, I wouldn't put those on yet until probably mid-October is when I would start putting entrance reducers on. I'd give them another month before adding those though. Summer brood versus fall brood. This is something else that usually you start noticing this time of year, and I certainly started noticing over the summer. Brood can be real spotty. The queen's kind of laying all over the place, and then once you start getting these rains, once you start getting a good pollen flow, that brood pattern can really tighten back up. Like you can see, these are just 2 comparison shots about 3 or 4 weeks apart. The top picture was in August. That bottom picture was a few days ago in September. And you kind of really start seeing that final major push for brood production here in late September. Okay, let me grab a few of those questions. Russell, when do you want me to wrap it up? What time? You must be on mute there, Russell. I'll grab a few of these questions here. Somebody asked, what do you look for in not accepting queens? You did a late summer split as well, and you're seeing tons of bees. So, it can be tough to get bees to accept queens in general. As far as what to look for if they've accepted a queen or not, look for eggs, look for larvae. That's a classic sign that they did accept a queen. You really need to at least see those larvae. If you start seeing a lot of capped brood, again, those are really good signs that the queen has been accepted. Seeing a lot of bees isn't necessarily a good indicator. You really want to see that brood to make sure that they did accept those queens. Someone asked, what is the white larva in the picture? If it was the picture, if it was the slide where I was talking about pollen patties, those were actually the small hive beetle larvae on the pollen patty. So that was what we were trying to avoid. This time of year, though, I mean, it's not at all uncommon to see, 3 or 4 larvae on a patty, small hive beetle larvae. When I'm going through hives, if I see that, I just pick up a patty, bang it off on the outside of the hive, get those larvae off and put it back in. The bees usually, the only reason those larvae are living in that patty is often because the bees can't get to that larva. And as soon as those bees finish off that pollen patty, they'll pull out those larvae and throw them out the front door. If I see, dozens of those larvae, then I take the patty off completely. You can throw it in the freezer, kill those larvae off, and then give it back to the bees. But in most cases, I see none or 3 or 4, and I can just bang them off and move on. Someone said you open fed pollen substitute and they didn't touch it. And why didn't they use it? Should I have stayed with patties this time of year? Yeah, so if there's a natural pollen flow, it's very, very rare for bees to forage on dry pollen substitute if there's a natural pollen flow. So that typically only works in the dead of winter, so like December, January. So this time of year, until we have some freezes, you do want to stick with the pollen patties inside the hive. And then once we get some good hard freezes and all the flowers die off, then you can do that open dry feeding, if that makes sense. So someone else asked, can you take some frames of honey from a strong hive and put them into a weaker hive? Absolutely. You can always trade frames of honey. You can even take a frame of brood from a strong hive, shake the bees off of it, and put that frame of brood in the very center of a weaker hive to give them a boost in strength. So, honey and brood are interchangeable as long as the hive that's donating it isn't overrun with isn't overrun with varroa mites or have some disease, because then you would transfer it to your weaker hive. But if they're a good strong hive, that's probably not the case. Doug asked, for the white larva, small hive beetle larva, you saw 10 to 15 between the boxes. How do you treat for them? The white larva you saw, you don't have pollen patties on the hive at all, but you still saw white larva between the two boxes. So my guess is what those probably are, if you didn't have pollen patties on, that's probably just drone brood. So between the two boxes, they'll actually build cells and the queen will actually lay in them, and they'll raise drones in between the boxes. And when you crack the boxes apart, you see these big fat white larvae sitting there, and that's usually drones. If it's small hive beetle larvae, they wiggle and crawl and run away essentially pretty fast. If it's drone larvae, they just sit there, they don't move. So that's how you can tell the difference. The small hive beetle larvae are fast, and they wiggle and they squirm and they fall between the frames and run off or wiggle off. The bee brood, the bee larvae, they just sit there. So probably you're just seeing the drone brood, and it's no big deal at all. If you do have small hive beetles larvae, there's really no good treatment for that. You really just have to get the hive as strong as you can. There's no treatment you could put inside the hive to get rid of the small hive beetles. So unfortunately. Russell, how are we doing? Do I have a few more minutes, or do we wrap it up?
Got a few more minutes.
Okay. One other topic I can touch on here. If you guys want a longer version of all this, we've got that uploaded on YouTube as well. But the one other side note that I want to mention is just fall and winter hive configuration. Should you go into winter with 2 boxes, 3 boxes, 17 boxes, double deeps? And I'm really talking about going into winter. I'm not talking about supering. But you can overwinter with 2 deep boxes, a deep and a medium box, 2 deeps and a medium. It doesn't really matter. I don't like to go through winter with just 1 single box. In general, I like to have at least 2 brood boxes. But the main goal is to have that 30 to 40 pounds of excess honey in your second box. That's really what your goal should be, to make sure your bees have plenty of food to overwinter. So you're not out there feeding all the time, because bees don't really eat syrup very well in the winter months. As far as having more than 2 boxes, if you've got 2 deep boxes and then you've got a medium on top of that, like you can see in the picture in the far right, if they're all decently full of honey and you've got bees in all of them, it's fine to overwinter them in 3 boxes. They don't have to be 2 boxes, or you don't have to try to cram them down into just a couple boxes. The bees don't actually keep the entire inside of all those boxes warm. They only keep their cluster warm. So you can overwinter with more than 2 boxes. What I usually tell people is, if that top box only has 4 or 5 pounds of honey in it and almost no bees, well, sure, you can pull it off. But if it's got 20 or 30 pounds of honey in it and it's half full of bees, then it's fine to leave it on. And later, as the winter progresses, you may pull it off as all the bees kind of vacate and eat the honey. But it's not a problem to go into winter with 3 boxes rather than, just the two. So that's the main thing I've got. There's always plenty to talk about this time of year, but I want to make sure I get all of your questions. Somebody asked, you have one hive that's requeened itself. How long before you check it to see if it worked versus combine it with another hive? So if they requeen themselves, you should see, I guess it depends on when you notice they requeen themselves and what you notice there. I mean, if you saw a capped queen cell, it's going to take, if you saw a capped queen cell, it could take anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks for them to have a laying queen, depending on, okay, you said she would have hatched a week ago. So once she hatches, it usually takes about 2 to 2.5 weeks for her to begin laying. So if she hatched a week ago, you should see eggs within the next 10 days, I'm going to say. 12 days, I would say. If you're not seeing eggs in 10 to 12 days, then I would go ahead and combine it with another hive. Scott asked, wouldn't wax-moths move into the extra boxes? So wax-moths aren't too much of a concern as we get later in the year, because especially once you get the first freeze, it wipes out wax-moths. So I'm not generally concerned about those excess boxes over the winter months. As long as you've got, I'm going to say, at least a quarter of that box full of bees, they should have no problem getting rid of the wax-moths. Now, if you've got 2 deep boxes and a medium box, and you've got 2 frames of bees in the bottom deep and 2 frames of bees in the top deep and 2 frames of bees in that medium box, okay, I might be a little concerned about wax-moths, because that's really not many bees to keep all those boxes protected. But if you've got 2 deep boxes packed with bees, and then you've got a medium on top that's half full of honey and bees, they're going to have no problem whatsoever keeping those boxes protected. So hopefully that's a kind of a vague answer to your question. But in general, if you've got a good, strong, healthy hive, they're not going to have a problem keeping those boxes protected. If you've got a really kind of small, weak hive, that's when I would start kind of combining them into just 2 boxes and just leaving them 2 boxes. So, okay, I think I got to all the questions there. I'm just scrolling through here to make sure. Yeah, it looks like it. So unless you need me to burn time, which I can always do, Russell, I think I'm done unless there are any other questions.
Well, I think we can move on. And Skip, you would like to introduce the speaker? I appreciate you doing that tonight, Blake.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
I think Pop was going to introduce him.
Ready?
Yeah.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. We got the speaker tonight, Bob Shackelford, Dr. Bob Shackelford. He was in our class several years ago, and he's still pretty active in working bees. And he even doing some work with people up in Oklahoma, trying to get some of them up there started in beekeeping through his family up there. He's a orthopedic surgeon by profession, but he's moved over into wound treatment, and I've talked to him about the fact that he uses honey in his wound treatment, and that's his specialty. So we're going to turn it over to Dr. Bob right now.
As I started, about 50 years ago, my dad caught a swarm of bees. After that, people started calling him, and ultimately he ended up with 7 hives. And back then, he'd just rob them, and that's really all there was. At the end of every year, we harvested our honey, didn't have a care in the world. There were varroa mites, all of the pests just weren't really an issue. So I went away to college and sort of lost track of his beekeeping. And then as I got into medical school, every once in a while, something about bees, what a bee can help this, pollen can help this. And we just went through a lot of different things that could possibly, that honey or the bee products could do. One of the things that I can tell you is there's nothing in a beehive that can poison you. You can eat anything. You can eat the propolis, the wax, the honey. I wouldn't eat the frames, but there's nothing that's toxic in a hive. So because of that, people have tried to see, or scientists have tried to look and see what can we use these individual bee products for. So I'll talk about just several of the ones that we've got, and then I'll get down to the specific uses of honey itself and my experience with that. I think the first really unique experience that I had was with bee sting therapy. While I'm talking, I'm going to throw out some words that anti-inflammatory, antioxidants, free radicals, an anti-inflammatory addresses itis. If you've got arthritis, tendonitis, bursitis, gastritis, any of those things are inflammatory processes. So basically an anti-inflammatory agent will try to address those problems. And so they see these chemicals are anti-inflammatory in their nature. Well, because they do that, it doesn't cure arthritis or it doesn't cure those problems, but it can help address those. But from the science standpoint, can we give this medication and will it help? We just, sometimes if the science isn't there, I'll let you know. And so the first most interesting one was bee sting therapy. It has anti-inflammatory aspects. It releases histamines. That's what causes the swelling, the inflammation, and it stimulates your body to make its own anti-inflammatory agents. So they tried it for diseases such as MS and a lot of neurologic diseases, but I have MS, and so it really caught my eye as a thought. But after I read all the studies, the only thing bee sting therapy does is hurt. There's not a whole lot that can be gained from it. The practitioners of bee sting therapy would charge $50 to $100 per bee sting, while for people that really believed it worked, and I thought, my gosh, they can go out in my backyard, slap a hive, and do that for free, and they don't have to worry about a lot. But bee sting therapy really doesn't have any specific benefit to us. The other thing about bee stings is every bee sting is unique. Every bee, even though they're all identical, their stings can be unique and can be different. And so a person that's been stung multiple times can have an anaphylactic reaction when stung by a bee. I think John's told me the story of a man who died who had an anaphylactic reaction to a bee, and he had been stung hundreds of times before. Just one came up and he was stung. So as you look at bee stings, it's always good to have an EpiPen around, just for yourself and for everybody, because that is a possibility. One of the next bee products is queen bee jelly. I remember when I was in college, it came out and everybody was taking queen bee jelly for just about everything under the sun. It's made by the nurse bees, and just the ability for the royal jelly to produce a queen is very unique, and science has looked at that because no other animal can do what bees do as far as the royal jelly. So in the holistic world, if something can do something that miraculous, take a regular bee and turn it into a queen, it has to have some miraculous properties, but it really doesn't. Whenever I looked at it, it's about 2/3 water, 1/8 proteins, 11% simple sugars, and some small quantities of vitamin C and various trace minerals and enzymes. So queen bee jelly has no major benefit whatsoever. The other is bee pollen, and what we always hear is I take bee pollen because it helps me with my my local allergies. Well, bee pollen has some vitamins, some antioxidants, it has some proteins, but once you digest it, it just goes into the basic products of the proteins. So does it help with your seasonal allergies? The science isn't there to prove it, but I have some people that swear it does help them. And what I tell them is it's not expensive. It's not going to hurt you. And so go ahead and take it. So the science between bee pollen and allergies is just not there. The other one is propolis. And if I thought anything, I go, well, propolis is just something that really makes a mess of my hive. It makes it hard to get my frames out. But actually they've studied propolis, and it's rich in antioxidants. It's rich in some special chemicals that do help with a lot of health problems. The chemicals themselves are known to help with some health problems, but the science there, can I take propolis and it will prevent this? No, there's nothing there to support that. The next is just the simple use of wax. Those are topical. Those are creams and candles and stuff like that. You don't want to eat that, or it's not going to hurt you, but it's certainly not going to help you to any significant degree. So those are just some of the products that we can see that have some questionable medical benefit. Finally, if we get down to honey, I trained in orthopedic surgery, and I was an orthopedic surgeon for 25 years. And what I've noticed over the last few years, our population we're becoming more and more diabetics. If we continue at our current rate, by the year 2050, 50% of our population will be full-blown insulin-dependent diabetics. Diabetics lose sensation in their feet. They start developing these horrible ulcers. And so those are now having to be managed by specialists. Our population is getting more obese. Because of that, they get vein problems in their legs break down and start forming these chronic wounds. And so in turn, it's become a specialty in and of itself. Wound care specialists over the last 5 years have really come into their own because it is becoming such a chronic problem. We're also getting an older population. Our skin is weaker, and so it's more susceptible to have injury. So there are multiple treatment modalities, but what we do know is honey has been used since 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, to treat wounds. But the key to that is we're not talking about just specific table honey. We're talking about Manuka honey. And Manuka honey is a special honey and it comes from the Melaleuca plant. Bees that are using the Melaleuca plant to create their honey develop special chemicals within the honey, and the one that's unique to Manuka honey is a substance called leptospermum. And I thought it had something to do with sex or something. I'm not sure. But that substance we found has some properties that help to kill bacteria, fungus, virus, yeast. Most of the chronic problems that we develop as far as infection are concerned in wound can be addressed by honey. It's really a benign treatment, and as I've gone into wound care, they have more sophisticated modalities, so I can put $500 worth of dressings on a wound once a week, or I can put 50 cents worth of honey and accomplish the same thing in many cases. So honey has turned out to be really quite a benefit to us, but not all Manuka honey is the same. They actually grade how much of the leptospermum is in each gram of honey. And to sell it as a Manuka or a medical grade honey, let's just say there's a grading of ultimate Melaleuca factor. and it grades from 0 to 20, and it can go above 20. But I just say the number 10 is what we grade. So if the FDA is looking at this Manuka honey and it's less than a 10, then it's really not considered a medical grade honey. One of the nice things about medical grade honey is it's sold over the counter. You can go to Walgreens, you can go just about any of the drugstores and find it over the counter. So it's inexpensive, and I teach a lot of patients, this is what you've got to do with this wound. Honey's going to be your basic treatment. And I usually start with honey in most of my patients, just simply because it's easy to use and it's inexpensive, and it is very adequate. I've carried a lot of wounds from the beginning to end, treating them with simple honey. And then I think as we look at that, that is a majority of what I have to say. Some of it I can get pretty sophisticated in the explanation of Manuka honey and the Manuka factors. I don't think that's all that relevant. I think it's just more important to know that there's a specific grade. It's tested. You can get it over the counter, but just don't use honey off of your table because it's not going to work. I've tasted the Manuka honey, and it's kind of bitter. It's not anything that you want to try to eat. But I just wanted to see what I was getting into while I was putting it on the wounds. So pretty much that's what I have to say about this. Are there any questions? Oh, the plant, it's the Melaleuca plant. Melaleuca, Melaleuca. It only grows in New Zealand. I went to New Zealand this summer and went to some of the places where they harvest the Manuka honey. Are there proven benefits of honey?
It's taking honey to help allergies.
No. And that's what whenever I talked earlier. No, honey is, it's absorbed, it's digested, and it's not anything unique about it. It just turns out to be a protein. But I have patients that swear that it works. Then I just say, go ahead and use it. If you think it works for you, it's inexpensive, go ahead and do it. So anyway.
Dr. Bob, there's another one that came across that says, I'll read it to you. It says, can you give examples of how to apply the honey, what type of dressings you use, or any kind of bandage changing? And then do you clean it first before you apply or reapplying? You know,
honey is water soluble, and so it washes off with simple normal saline. You can buy normal saline over the counter, and it's inexpensive. And usually with the honey, we change the dressings on a daily basis, simply because it is honey. We put it on and we hold it in place with a gauze and change it on a daily basis. Anyway, you just apply it directly to the wound. You can put a small amount on the wound, make sure the wound is covered. If you put too much on it, of course, it's going to do what honey does, and it's going to seep out. You'll see it, it'll absorb into the dressings, and it'll stay in contact with the wound. It's very good at addressing wounds. It keeps the bacterial count much lower. It actually forms a hydrogen peroxide-like substance.
Okay, so I have one here. It says, for the healing process, do you recommend your patients take the Manuka honey orally also?
No, the Manuka honey, it tastes terrible. And it's absorbed just like anything else. The Manuka honey is a topical agent. And so that's what it does is it comes into contact with the skin. It forms a peroxidase, which is in a way a hydrogen peroxide that oxidizes the living substance. And actually, too much hydrogen peroxide will kill skin cells. So to dress a wound, we put hydrogen peroxide on once, clean it up, but honey forms a lower grade of that and will kill just about everything: bacteria, virus, fungus, yeast.
Another one put on here says, does honey on the wounds help heal them faster or just keep the infection away?
You know, there's a certain level of, whenever we talk about infection, some people think it's infected or it's not infected. So say like 0 infection is sterile. I use that in the wound. 10 infection is the flesh-eating bacteria, and you're going to die within a few hours. So if a level of bacteria reaches about 4, that fights the skin for oxygen. It fights the skin for protein. And so the cells that are trying to grow over the wound are fighting with the specific level of bacteria. So if you cut the bacterial count down, the cells that are coming across have more oxygen, they have more protein, they have more nutrients. And so, yes, some wounds that wouldn't heal actually heal, and wounds treated with the honey do heal faster. Yes, that's a purpose.
Okay, and they were asking about, do you saturate the wound with honey or is it a light smear? And then they were asking about, does it adhere to the dressing and removing the scab? So is that removal of the scab and then reapplying the honey?
You know, most of the time, if you apply the honey, you know, it's to say how much. I think if you put it on and you take your finger and you rub it across the wound, and it's, you know, you can see it across the wound. I would say less is better. If it's draining out, I have some people that have small wounds, and what they do is they just put the honey in a Band-Aid, put it on the Band-Aid, and then sit down and put it on the wound. You can do the same thing with gauze, is you can put it in the gauze, just enough to put on the wound, and then set it down on the wound, and that will be sufficient. If it's coming out and it's completely saturating your dressing, of course, that's too much. So whenever you take the dressing off, you should see that the honey's just kind of in the area of where the wound is. And then, I can't remember part of that question.
Yeah, there was a dressing adherence. Does it prevent that?
And so, yes, because honey is water soluble, it can dry out. And then you just use the normal saline or the water to gradually lift it up. But if you look underneath, there is a cleaner wound. It has less bacteria in it. And so, yes, most wounds that we see make a little fluid in and of themselves. And so we have more of an issue of too much fluid. But if it does tend to dry out, you know, the thing about the honey is you could change it 3 times a day and it will not hurt. So we do it once a day just by convention. Some patients will go every other day, and that can be very effective too. So you're just trying to keep some honey in contact with the base of the wound. And if it does dry out, then you can, you know, it debrides or it cleans the wound as it comes off.
Okay, so, and if somebody put on here, what's your experience as far as healing diabetic ulcers?
And so these are my thoughts about diabetic ulcers. They're shear ulcers. The skin is rubbing back and forth. It's not just pressure. So every time you take a wound and you put it on the ground, the skin on top shears across the bottom that it's trying to contact. And so literally, if you can keep all the weight off of a diabetic ulcer, then you can heal it. Honey keeps the bacterial count down. I use it all the time for diabetic ulcers. But literally, if you walk on it and you put your foot on it once a day and it shears off, then all the skin around the edges that's trying to grow in rips off its base, and you start all over again. So that's my biggest problem with diabetics, is they don't realize that when we say non-weight bearing, it's non-weight bearing. No weight at all. What I tell them is put a little wrap, some bubble wrap around it. And as long as those bubbles don't pop, you're good to go. But if you pop those bubbles, then you've lost the race.
Somebody was asking, do you know how long that the Manuka honey is good for once it's been opened? Is it a day or?
Honey is honey. It was in the pyramids, and Manuka honey after 20 years is Manuka honey. So as long as it's in a liquid form, you can put it on. So there's not a date on it. No.
And then somebody also asked, is Manuka the only honey for wound care, or can you use some of the other honeys?
No, Manuka is the only. The leptospermum is the special product that defines it as a medical grade honey. And really, it's the only one that scientifically has been proven to address wounds with a bacterial count.
Okay. And then somebody here put on there, what's the largest surface of area you've treated with the honey?
Oh my gosh. I would say, it's really hard. 100 square centimeters. They're wounds that are completely circumferential around the bottom aspect of a leg. And so just some massive wounds. There's some wounds are just too big to address with it. But there's as long if you can get the dressing on it, if you can saturate the Manuka into the dressing and put a dressing on it, there's no real limitation in the size. But some of the ones that I've treated have been massive, very, very big.
Okay, and then another question was asking whether you need to debride the wound or just rinse it and then reapply honey.
Once a week in wound care, we debride the wounds. Ours is a little more aggressive. We have a special curette. We tend to localize or numb up the skin and debride it. So about once a week, yes, it should be pretty much aggressively debrided. I want to get it down to red, beefy granulation tissue. And so your body will debride that, and honey will help you to clean all of that junk out. So the daily debridement, no, but what we do know from science is wounds that are debrided once a week do consistently heal better than wounds that are not.
Okay, and then here's one said, as far as Manuka honey on wounds that are necrotizing bacteria.
Oh, necrotizing fasciitis is the cat is out of the bag. Manuka is it's step 1, and you need to be at step 20. Necrotizing fasciitis, they cut them open, they flay them open, and they take a small wound and turn it. They can open up a whole leg. Once they've healed the bacteria, once they've healed that infection, then after that, you've got a long chronic wound that you can start treating with honey. But aggressive necrotizing fasciitis is treated surgically. You have to cut it out.
And then somebody put in said that some of our regular honeys had the same similar peroxide properties. They said, wanting to know if you've tried using it.
None of the other it's the leptospermum. They've done the chemical studies of it and said what's unique about this honey that helps it address the infection, and it just happens to be the Manuka. None of the other honeys, they studied them, and they're just like putting sugar water on the wound. So it definitely needs to be a medical grade. You need a greater than 10 count. Like I said, when I was in New Zealand, a pint of 30 grade Manuka honey sold for $5,000. So, and that's certainly a lot more than we need to address the wounds. But I guess technically you need to use less of it. But it's certainly nothing like that over the counter.
Yeah, the one I have here at the honey house is a UMF 12 plus.
Yes. Mm-hmm. What's that? A universal Melaleuca factor?
Yeah.
And with that, there are so many other ways they grade it. There's the unique Manuka factor is UMO, and then there's MGO, which is the maximum methylglyoxal amount, which is basically, that's a bacterial keeping property that the Manuka provides. So each one of those have different numbers. I wish they just had a 1 to 10, but they don't. One goes from 5 to 20, and the other one goes from 83 to 829. So how can you decide which one? I don't know, but you'll find that most of the honeys will somewhere let you know what the UMF is. It has to be above 10 before they can use it as a medical grade honey.
So like buying it at Walmart, I'd probably stay away from versus if I saw it at like CVS or Walgreens or something like that.
You know, it's you can look at it and it's going to identify whether it's CVS. You'll find that the providers will, you know, sell it to Walgreens versus CVS, and they'll sell it to everybody. So where you buy it is not really that much of an issue. To be labeled Manuka honey or medical grade honey, it has to be 10 or plus in the UMF, unique Manuka factor. So you can get it anywhere you want to, anywhere you can find it. If it's medical grade honey, it's going to be the same. So Walmart is as good as any place. I would go where it's the least expensive.
I think I've seen it about $25 a bottle to $30 a bottle there at Walmart.
Yeah. And so we sell it we don't sell it. We use it in small tubes, and you can buy it in a tube. It's a little bit easier to apply out of the tube because you just squirt it onto the gauze and set that onto the wound. So that's the way, but we'll give them a 2-gram tube, and it'll last them till the next week. Sometimes it'll last them a couple of weeks. So it goes a long way.
Somebody said Nelson honey from New Zealand is sold by Beekeepers. We had their representative speak a few years ago.
Okay. And so, you know, honey from New Zealand, hopefully they're talking about the Manuka honey. You could go to New Zealand, you could have bees that are pollinating and that are developing the nectar from another plant beside the Manuka plant. And it's not Manuka, or it's not a medical grade honey. So whenever we were in New Zealand, we went to just fields and fields of the Melaleuca plant, and they set their hives in those fields. So they knew a majority of the nectar came from those plants. But if you put them out in the field away from the Manuka plant, the Melaleuca plants, they just have to grade it. It's something that they can test. They can do a study on it and determine, does it have the ingredients that are necessary.
Is this the flowers that was grown up in the mountains, where they have to send the beehives up into the mountains?
You know, whenever we went, it was New Zealand. It's just more, it's not a mountain thing. You know, we were just outside of one of the local cities. So no, it's not anything special or exotic. It's just, I don't know why the tea tree doesn't grow in the United States, but it doesn't.
Is there any more questions? Medical questions? Honey questions?
That was a great presentation. Appreciate all the info that you brought to our attention.
Yeah, just kind of one of the aspects of, I think, as we have bees, we get curious about a lot of stuff. You get beekeepers together and they can talk for hours about whatever.
Or I don't know if you know this or not, but the Manuka honey becoming more and more adulterated, where they're trying to sell the regular honey as Manuka. I mean,
you know, it's really hard as we do from a reputable dealer. You know, I guess anybody. But the peculiar thing that I've noticed about Manuka honey is it's a bitter honey. It's not. Yeah. It doesn't taste nice. So if you thought you were getting adulterated Manuka honey, all you have to do is taste it, and then you could figure, you know, hey, this isn't too bad. I'd put it on a piece of bread. But the Manuka honey, you certainly would not. Okay. Right. You know, okay. I think all of us realize if your bees are harvesting at the wrong time of the year, they're harvesting in the wrong place, that you get some pretty crazy honey.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but the prices they sell it for, I'm sure everybody's trying to get in on the money.
The nice thing about Manuka honey is it's relatively inexpensive as far as our wound care management are concerned. And that's what I like best about it, because a lot of our patients are indigent or having to pay for this on their own. And so to say, here, you can pick this up at Walgreens, CVS, or Walmart, and then we kind of give them an idea of what to look for. They look for it and find it, and they're good to go.
I've got another one here. Just posted. It says, notice that there's a brown spot left that fades with time. Have you experienced that?
Noticed a what now?
It's a brown spot that left with the honey, Manuka honey, and that fades with time. Says, have you experienced any of that in your wound care?
Just topical, a brown spot on the skin. They were using that to treat like an age spot.
No. This is after they've been treating.
Okay. And so I'd almost have to see that to understand exactly what we're talking about. So for the most part, Manuka honey it's going to be on an open wound. It's going to be on, usually this wound has some sort of drainage. And then after that, I'm not sure. No, exactly. There are several different kinds of brown spot. Okay. It covers the area of previous
wound.
Yes, it covers the area of a previous wound, fades after about 1 to 2 years.
Oh, okay. And so most of the time what you see is that's just the natural new tissues growing over it. Okay. And it looks more like T what?
A T stain than an age spot.
Yeah. And so that's just sort of the nature. A wound heals over. It's just a giant flat scar is what it is as it comes in. So over time, over months, they'll actually shrink down. They'll get smaller and they'll get more and more solid. But yeah, the first time when a wound first heals, it's just paper thin. That has to thicken up. And so that can certainly have different colors to it. But we don't worry about that too much. And does the Manuka honey address that change in the color? No, not at all.
Okay, this one, she wrote another one. She says, what would be wound signs at this time to move on for another treatment regime?
You know, the way we do it is we measure our wounds. Every week, somebody comes in, we measure how long, how wide. And in fact, there are actually some computer programs now that we take a picture of it with a small dot next to it to determine the size. The next week we come in, we take a picture again. It gives us what is the area. And usually by 4 weeks, our wound should be about 40% smaller if we're aggressively addressing a wound. And so what we want to do is if I see a wound on the second week after 2 weeks, if it's 2 different measurements, it hasn't gotten smaller, then you move on. But in diabetics, what I see is the problem is they're cheating and they're walking on it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, unless you have anything else, Bob, I guess that we need to conclude.
Oh, here's another one. Since want to know about Manuka and anything on poison ivy.
You know, Manuka has some anti-inflammatory properties, and so it can be sort of soothing, but to say, yeah, it's a good treatment of poison ivy, nope. It's, you know, I would be used more like Benadryl, an antihistamine, because that's what poison ivy is. It's a inflammatory reaction like that. So whenever you think of honey, think of chronic wounds long. They've been present for weeks, or they've been, you know, sometimes we're talking months. Okay. Some side effects from the antihistamines. And then are you talking about topical or by mouth? Okay. Then.
Both.
It's unusual for an antihistamine. Then after that, you know, we tend to look at cortisone, Cordate, or something like that for poison ivy.
Somebody just posted Manuka honey effective for cold sores.
And so, you know, there is some literature about that. In fact, they talk about even using propolis for cold sores. Sometimes the problem with that is keeping it in contact with the wound itself. The wound is just in an odd spot, and you put the honey on. How do you put a Band-Aid there and keep it intact? That seems to be the biggest problem of that, is putting it into the wound and keeping it there. So, but it certainly has the properties to help with that. But what we seem to know is even the dermatologist, you get a cold sore, it breaks, and then it settles down. It certainly helps to stop a secondary infection. But actual treatment of the cold sore and making it end quicker, probably not.
I know for some of the wound cares we have just around the house and stuff like that, my wife made a propolis tincture, and we use that kind of like a tincture of benzoin, cover the wound and get it, and it does turn it yellow, and it kind of gives it a good sealing properties on it.
Yes, and that's propolis, is probably the least likely, from my standpoint, of the bee products to work for anything, because it gives me the most trouble. But yes, it definitely topically, propolis for those type of things, for skin, not for a specific wound, but for soothing of smaller, I'm really talking about deep wounds all the way through the skin into the dermis underneath the skin. So for the more superficial things, there are a lot of wax a lot of people make emollients out of wax, and it's very good at hand creams and lotions. So, and honey is a part of the therapy of that substance.
Yeah, she wrote another one, said, is there any skin areas to avoid using Manuka?
No, there's not.
And then, of course, yes, fresh propolis, or it actually stays. I've actually got a jar of propolis we saved. So, yeah, it's good for a long time.
Yeah, everything that the bees make lasts forever. None of those tend to degenerate. The only thing that would degenerate would be the honey itself.
I've got one of our students asked about propolis for treatment for eczema.
And so eczema just means dry skin is what we're talking about there. So there's, if it's a systemic, a disease, an eczema type of disease that's in like, I can't remember some of the specifics, but anyway, not being a dermatologist, they lose me sometimes. But anyway, I don't really see it. I would be more likely to use the wax and the propolis type of topical creams. But the first thing we treat eczema with is simple Vaseline. We found it to be as successful as anything. And if you go to the dermatologist, that's where he's going to start first, if you're talking about that.
Plantar fasciitis.
No. Honey's going to be on something superficial. Plantar fasciitis is too deep in the foot.
And then propolis, same thing, just too deep in the foot.
Yeah. All of these things are going to be topical. We're going to be talking about the skin and the dermis, something like a scrape. And they're not going to work on anything that's deep in the muscles or down in the fascia. No. Just too deep.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to let Mary ask you any more questions. So she's the one that's lower than all these. Anyway.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to help with the bunions either.
Okay. We're getting way out of line here, I think.
Yeah.
But anyway. Okay. Thank you again for coming on here. Appreciate you giving up your time to do this.
Well,
and learned a lot.
Yeah, I certainly enjoyed Blake's talk.
He's good. Really do like to hear him.
Yeah.
Okay.
He knows what he's doing.
All right.
Okay. So I'm ready to sign off.
Thank
There you
sir.
go. Okay.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Take care.
Anybody have anything they want to bring up before we sign off?
I'm wondering, one of the hives, it seems the bees in the particular hive, they seem a lot more aggressive than the other hives, or seem to be a lot more docile. As soon as you take that lid off, they start attacking real aggressively. What do you have any idea what this?
So first you need to check your pollen stores and honey stores to see if they're in a protection mode. If you're lacking food in that hive, they will go into a very protective mode, and they will sting just about anybody that comes close to it. So they're trying to protect everything they got in the hive. So that's what I would look at first. If you've got plenty of honey and plenty of pollen stores and plenty of bees, and they're still coming after you pretty bad, you probably have a hot hive.
I see. Okay.
It's a hive that we split, and it's the original hive before the split.
And the population seems to be high on it too, so that might be, they might be, there's a lot of bees in there. So
Yeah, I would start checking your pollen stores and your honey stores. If you don't have a whole lot in there, they're protecting what they got.
okay.
Thanks for all the questions, Mary Ann. Hate to be hard on you. Okay. All right. Well, it's 8 o'clock, or right at. So, I guess that will conclude our meeting, and we'll meet back here again next month for the foreseeable future anyway. So, appreciate everything you did, Skip, John. Appreciate y'all getting the speaker together.
All right, thanks.
Mike, appreciate all you do. Okay.
You're welcome.
We will talk, I guess, next Monday night for the
Business
board meeting. And see everyone next week.